May 28, 1940. Fort des Dunes, France. Major Mohammed Akbar Khan surveyed the scene before him, at 8 in the morning. Defeated army in thousands in utter confusion. The most depressing sight he had ever witnessed. British discipline had collapsed. Thousands of soldiers milled about the beaches of Dunkirk in panic and disorder. Yet standing in stark contrast, 300 Indian mule drivers formed up in orderly column. They had marched through the night under continuous German bombardment. They had abandoned their beloved mules only hours before, animals they had cared for since leaving Bombay 7 months earlier. Now they prepared for evacuation, maintaining discipline when chaos reigned around them. These men represented Force K6, the only Indian unit present at Dunkirk. Within a generation, their contribution would be systematically erased from both British and South Asian memory. They would become victims of what one historian calls the strange determination to misremember the empire. This wasn't a minor footnote. 1,723 Indian soldiers maintained discipline when thousands panicked, earned gallantry medals under fire, and saw one entire company captured by the Wehrmacht. Their story challenges the plucky little Britain standing alone narrative, while revealing uncomfortable truths about colonial military service and institutional racism. Force K6 consisted of 4 animal transport companies from the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, approximately 1,723 personnel, plus over 2,700 mules. These were not frontline combat troops, but professional soldiers providing critical logistic support to the British Expeditionary Force in terrain where mechanized vehicles failed. The 4 companies had arrived in Marseille on December 26, 1939, after sailing from Bombay without losing a single mule during the voyage. They were deliberately recruited from Punjabi Muslim communities around Rawalpindi, Chakwal, Campbellpur, and Jhelum in what would become Pakistan after 1947. The command structure revealed both hierarchy and competence. Lieutenant Colonel Hills commanded overall, but the 25th Company was led by Major Mohammed Akbar Khan, who stood 6'2" and was the senior-most Indian officer in the entire Indian Army at that time. The 32nd Company was commanded by Captain Ashdown, father of future British politician Paddy Ashdown, whose defiance of racist orders would later earn him a court-martial. Viceroys commissioned officers like Jemadar Maula Dad Khan led individual troops, though British colonial hierarchy ensured the most junior British officer always outranked all Indian officers regardless of experience. The British Army had adopted a not-a-horse-in-the-force policy, committing to complete mechanization. But once deployed to France during the brutal winter of 1939-40, one of the severest in 125 years, commanders realized motorized transport bogged down in mud-filled terrain. Animal transport was hastily reintroduced. Each division received an allocation of 400 mules. The mules were even subjected to a de-voicing procedure, having their vocal cords removed, to prevent braying near enemy lines. During the Phoney War from December 1939 through May 9, 1940, Force K6 performed routine supply delivery. They groomed mules, delivered ammunition and supplies, and received visits from dignitaries including the Duke of Gloucester. Then, on May 10, 1940, Germany launched Vollgelb. As one British source noted, Sitzkrieg became Blitzkrieg. The 25th Company's ordeal provides the most detailed account of Indian soldiers' experience. On May 19th, 6 Messerschmitts bombed their airfield at Marquette-les-Lille. The next day they received marching orders and began a 35-mile westward trek along the Belgian border. Major Akbar Khan's memoir reveals a stunning moment. A British staff officer told him to tell my men to throw away their arms and attempt to reach Dunkirk individually, unarmed, surrendering if intercepted. Khan wrote, "As a Muslim, I refuse to be guided by fears." He kept the 300-man company together as a cohesive unit. On May 24th came the defining moment for Jemadar Maula Dad Khan. His troop came under combined ground artillery and Luftwaffe bombing while approaching Dunkirk. The official citation for his Indian Distinguished Service Medal reads, "Jemadar Maula Dad Khan showed magnificent courage, coolness, and decision. When his troop was shelled from the ground and bombed from the air by the enemy, he promptly reorganized his men and animals, got them off the road and under cover under extremely difficult conditions. It was due to this initiative and the confidence he inspired that it was possible to extricate his troop without loss in men or animals." This was the third highest decoration in the Indian military hierarchy, and only 3 were awarded for British Expeditionary Force service in 1940. At the Cassel Chateau, 18 horses and mules were killed by German bombing and shelling. On May 26th, orders came to abandon the mules and equipment, carrying only personal kit and 6 days' rations. An English sergeant noted the Indian soldiers were very distressed at having to leave their animals behind, since they were much attached to them. These men had cared for their mules since Bombay in December, a 7-month bond, severed by military necessity. On the night of May 27th to 28th, the 25th Company marched toward Dunkirk, through continuous German bombardment. Major Akbar Khan observed Dunkirk now in ruins, burning furiously and being bombed incessantly. They arrived at Fort des Dunes in the early hours of May 28th. In stark contrast to the thousands of panicked soldiers, the 300 Indian mule drivers formed up in orderly column. They carried their disabled imam and 6 soldiers on mules as far as they could before releasing the animals to local French civilians. At 1800 hours on May 28th, they began the march to the East Mole, the mile-long breakwater that was the primary evacuation point. The journey across the beach took 8 hours to cover approximately 5 miles due to congestion, bombing, and chaos. Major Akbar Khan led from the front, maintaining unit cohesion throughout. By 3 in the morning on May 29th, all 300 men had embarked on various vessels. They arrived at Dover at 9 in the morning, part of the 47,000 troops evacuated that day. The Women's Voluntary Service greeted them with tea and biscuits. According to multiple accounts, the soldiers celebrated by borrowing brass trays and playing Punjabi folk music on the Dover quayside, singing and dancing. Even some British spectators joined in. A contemporary British officer later wrote, "During the chaos of the withdrawal, they maintained the discipline, turnout, and self-respect which many around them had lost, enhancing the reputation of the Indian Army." The 32nd Company's evacuation involved perhaps the most dramatic act of individual moral courage. Captain Ashdown received explicit orders from a senior British commander during the chaotic retreat: evacuate only British officers and abandon the Indian soldiers to the Germans. Ashdown, according to his son Paddy, flatly refused any thought of leaving behind his beloved men and repudiated the blatantly racist order. He secured berths on evacuation ships for all his Indian soldiers. His defense: "I simply thought that these were my men, I was responsible for them, and must bring them back." Upon returning to Britain, he was court-martialed for insubordination. The military tribunal ultimately threw out the case, recognizing that Ashdown had acted with honor even if technically violating orders. This incident reveals that institutional racism extended to evacuation priorities. Some British commanders viewed Indian lives as more expendable than white British lives. Not all were so fortunate. The 22nd Mule Company, stationed with British divisions near the Maginot Line in eastern France, could not reach Dunkirk in time. Approximately 300 to 320 men were captured by advancing German forces in early June 1940. They endured nearly 5 years as prisoners of war in German camps. Driver Kane Din contracted tuberculosis in a Polish camp and died on a hospital ship after repatriation. Driver Dost Mohammed died in a prisoner of war camp in Berlin in November 1941. 5 Indian soldiers from Force K6 are commemorated on the Dunkirk Memorial, having died as prisoners with no known graves. Yet, even in captivity, some demonstrated extraordinary resourcefulness. Jemadar Maula Dad, a 26-year veteran of the British Indian Army, executed a daring escape. He disguised himself as a French colonial soldier and eventually reached British-controlled Gibraltar after crossing multiple countries. For this feat, he was awarded the MBE by King George VI, one of the few recognitions Indian soldiers received for Dunkirk service. At least 10 successful prisoner-of-war escapes occurred, aided by French resistance networks. Beyond Maula Dad Khan's medal, several individuals earned recognition. Jemadar Din received a mention in dispatches, noting he displayed leadership and devotion to duty of a very high order, untiring in efforts to maintain morale and discipline, ready to accept any mission however arduous or dangerous. Major Mohammed Akbar Khan himself became a figure of British wartime propaganda. An official war artist painted his portrait, which was exhibited at the National Gallery and now permanently hangs at the Imperial War Museum. The physical and psychological conditions faced by Indian soldiers during the May 1940 retreat were harrowing. Constant Luftwaffe Stuka dive bomber attacks with their infamous sirens, plus Messerschmitt strafing runs. One soldier later described it as being like a rat in a cage with a cat inside it. German ground forces shelled approach roads and beaches. The 25th Company covered 35 miles on May 20th alone, then continued cross-country marching for days with minimal rest. Some units went 2 days with nothing but a few biscuits. On May 26th, orders came to jettison all equipment except personal kit and rations. During the final approach to Dunkirk beaches, they were ordered to discard even their packs and blankets, marching with only the clothes they wore. Beyond physical hardship, the forced abandonment of mules caused profound distress. These animals had been in the soldiers' care since December 1939. Contemporary accounts emphasize how attached the men were to their animals. The statistics tell part of the story. Total force K6 strength in France, approximately 1,723 Indian ranks plus British officers and support personnel. 2,700 mules shipped from Bombay, all abandoned or killed. 3 companies evacuated successfully, the 25th, 29th, and 32nd. 1 company captured, the 22nd, approximately 300 to 320 men. The 25th Company evacuated from Dunkirk beaches, 300 to 312 men. Total Indians evacuated, approximately 630,000, compared to 338,226 total Operation Dynamo evacuations. They represented roughly 0.19% of the total evacuation. The erasure of Indian soldiers from Dunkirk memory represents what one researcher calls a double forgetting. They were systematically excluded from historical narratives in both Britain and South Asia, though for entirely different reasons. In Britain, the deliberate cultivation of the Dunkirk spirit propaganda required a specific narrative, plucky little Britain standing alone against Nazi tyranny. As historian Yasmin Khan explains, having all these imperial contributions complicated that narrative. Churchill's June 4, 1940 speech, "We shall fight on the beaches," transformed military defeat into defiant survival, but only if Britain appeared to stand alone. Imperial contributions were structurally excluded from post-war British education. Khan writes that generations of British schoolchildren, including me, sat through history lessons about World War II and never heard about the connection to Asia. Post-war Britain, facing housing shortages and economic crisis, quickly shifted from viewing colonial allies as heroes to viewing them as immigrants. Research documents how the warm wartime welcome very quickly evaporated after the cessation of hostilities in 1945. The Christopher Nolan film controversy in 2017 crystallized this amnesia. His film Dunkirk featured 0 Indian soldiers despite extensive research. When critics raised the omission, defenders argued the film wasn't attempting comprehensive documentation. The controversy revealed how cinematic memory has replaced historical memory for most people, and how exclusion perpetuates itself across generations. The forgetting in India and Pakistan had entirely different causes. Academic Omar Salim Khan explains, "The trauma of 1947 wiped out everything else. 47 is a cutoff point in collective memory. People have put up walls inside their memories. The horrific violence of partition, estimates of 1 to 2 million dead, 10 to 15 million displaced, so dominated consciousness that everything before became irrelevant." Additionally, World War II posed uncomfortable questions for nationalist narratives. These soldiers served a colonial power against which their countrymen were fighting for independence. The Quit Indian movement of August 1942 saw 100,000-plus arrests and over 1,000 Indians killed by British forces suppressing protests, while simultaneously 2.5 million Indians volunteered for military service. This contradiction didn't fit cleanly into post-independence narratives in either India or Pakistan. For Pakistan specifically, 1940 had different significance. The Lahore Resolution on March 23, 1940, when the Muslim League first demanded independent Muslim states, was far more important to national mythology than Dunkirk. As Yasmin Khan notes, the war is in South Asia commonly viewed as simply part of the run-up to partition and independence in 1947, rather than as a significant military achievement worth commemorating. Contemporary British views of Indian troops were deeply contradictory, reflecting the tensions inherent in colonial military structures. Official British military assessments praised Force K-6's performance. Gallantry medals were awarded. Major Akbar Khan and driver Abdul Ghani were selected for portrait paintings by official war artists, extraordinary recognition. Force K-6 was featured in propaganda and advertising, including Sunlight soap campaigns and anti-racist editorial cartoons. Yet this coexisted with profound institutional racism. The martial race theory, pseudoscientific ideology, determining that only 3% of adult Indian males had the aptitude and sense to become a modern soldier, governed all recruitment. The colonial hierarchy was rigidly maintained. Viceroy-commissioned officers could never command British troops, and the most junior British officer outranked all Indian officers, no matter how senior. Indian officers were barred from the officers' mess. Pay disparities were stark. Indian soldiers received far lower wages compared to their British counterparts for identical duties. Compensation to families of fallen Indian soldiers was significantly lower than for British casualties. Most revealing were British fears about Indian troops fighting white Europeans. Military doctrine held that Indian troops should only fight colonial wars against non-white opponents, because British authorities feared that if Indian troops fought white Europeans, they would become contaminated and come to view whites as their equals, thus undermining the entire colonial system. The wartime experience of Force K-6 in Britain from 1940 to 1944 both challenged and reinforced racial hierarchies in complex ways. Challenges to racial assumptions included unprecedented British public acceptance. The soldiers were welcomed into British homes, invited to local events, featured positively in national media, and celebrated in 61 public parades. They met the King and Queen. Their professional competence directly contradicted stereotypes. They maintained discipline when British units collapsed into chaos. They earned gallantry decorations in combat conditions. They successfully performed specialized mule transport operations that mechanized British forces could not. However, racial hierarchies were simultaneously reinforced through structural mechanisms. Segregated facilities continued. The officers' mess remained off-limits to Indian officers regardless of rank. Pay disparities and unequal casualty compensation continued throughout the war. The public framing of Force K-6 emphasized exoticism rather than equality. The 61 parades showcased them as exotic foreigners, wearing turbans, not as equal members of the British military. Their welcome, while genuine, was for allies and colonial subjects, supporting the mother country, not as peers. Most tellingly, the welcome evaporated instantly after 1945. Research shows that as housing competition intensified post-war, former allies quickly became immigrants to be feared or resented. None of Force K6 returned to settle in Britain, and their contributions were rapidly forgotten. This revealed the contingent nature of wartime acceptance. It served immediate needs but transformed no fundamental attitudes. The contrast between wartime celebrity and post-war neglect is stark. During 1940 to 1944, Force K6 soldiers were near celebrities in Britain, extensively photographed, featured in newsreels, painted by official war artists with exhibitions at the National Gallery, used in advertising campaigns. Then they returned to India in January 1944 and vanished from British consciousness entirely. No systematic recognition followed. Unlike British Dunkirk veterans who received honours, pensions, and lasting commemoration, Indian soldiers received minimal pensions with promises made during recruitment, often unfulfilled. The 35 soldiers who died while stationed in the UK, primarily from flu epidemics, and are buried in British cemeteries, including Brecon Cemetery in Wales and multiple sites in Scotland, represent the only permanent physical memorial to Force K6 in Britain. These graves went largely unrecognized for decades. It wasn't until 2020 that a researcher erected a memorial in Kingussie, Scotland, black granite imported from India with gold leaf engravings, as the first permanent UK memorial specifically recognizing all ranks of Force K6. This was 80 years after their service. Understanding Force K6 requires contextualizing their role within the largest volunteer army mobilization in history. When war began in September 1939, the Indian Army numbered approximately 205,000. By August 1945, it had grown to over 2.5 million volunteers, a 12-fold expansion. Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief India 1943 to 1945, stated bluntly, "Britain couldn't have come through both wars if they hadn't had the Indian Army." Indian troops deployed globally. North Africa, divisions fought at Operation Compass, El Alamein, Tunisia. East Africa, defeated Italian forces at Keren, Eritrea, Ethiopia. Italy, divisions fought at Monte Cassino and the Gothic Line. Burma, 700,000 of the 1 million troops in the 14th Army were Indian. The human cost was staggering. 87,000 to 89,000 Indian servicemen killed. 64,354 wounded. 67,340 prisoners of war. 3 million civilian deaths, including the Bengal famine of 1943. The political context was profoundly contradictory. Viceroy Linlithgow declared war on Germany without consulting Indian political leaders, sparking immediate crisis. The Indian National Congress demanded independence as the price for war support. When Britain refused, Congress launched the Quit India movement in August 1942, the most serious rebellion since 1857. British forces killed over 1,000 Indian protesters and arrested 100,000 plus. Simultaneously, 2.5 million Indians volunteered for military service. This wasn't a national war for India. It was a colonial obligation undertaken while fighting for independence from the very power they served. Yet, economic coercion played a major role. 2 centuries of British extraction had created such abject poverty that Indians were ready to grab at any opportunity to gain a living, even if it was in the business of death. Research reported that Northwest Indian troops gained 5 to 10 pounds within 4 months on army rations, indicating severe pre-enlistment malnutrition. Force K6 represented the first contribution of this massive war machine to the European theatre. While their numbers at Dunkirk were small, their presence symbolized the Empire's mobilization that would ultimately provide Britain's strategic reserve throughout the war. The recovery of this forgotten history is remarkably recent, concentrated in the last decade. Groundbreaking research conducted over 7 years culminated in a 2019 dissertation and the 2020 book, The Indian Contingent, The Forgotten Muslim Soldiers of the Battle of Dunkirk. The researcher conducted over 100 oral history interviews with relatives and witnesses across Europe and South Asia, examined war diaries at the National Archives, and created a database of 2,238 names of Force K6 soldiers. The work applied the concept of selective forgetting. What stays in the collective memory of a nation is what fits within their framework of culture and history. These soldiers fitted neither in the UK nor Pakistan, and so they have slipped away from official and popular memory. Oxford historian Yasmin Khan wrote The Raj at War, A People's History of India's Second World War in 2015, bringing Indian wartime experiences to mainstream attention. Her 2017 op-ed following the Nolan film sparked widespread debate. Khan argues that British education exhibits a strange determination to misremember the empire, with generations of British schoolchildren learning nothing about Asian contributions to World War II. Institutional recognition remains limited but growing. The Imperial War Museums now includes Indian Army contributions in exhibitions. War memorials increasingly acknowledge Empire forces. The 35 graves of Force K6 soldiers in UK cemeteries have been documented. A memorial was erected in Kingussie, Scotland in 2020, black granite from India with gold leaf engravings, as the first permanent UK monument to Force K6. Yet collective amnesia persists. A 2014 poll found 59% of Britons proud of the empire, with only 19% ashamed. Popular histories and films continue to exclude colonial contributions. In India and Pakistan, the trauma of partition continues to overshadow World War II memory. The story of Force K6 reveals how historical memory serves political purposes. 1,723 Indian soldiers provided critical logistic support to the British Expeditionary Force, earned gallantry decorations under fire, maintained exceptional discipline during chaotic retreat, endured 5 years as prisoners of war, and served 4 years in Britain, yet were systematically erased from both British and South Asian collective memory within a generation. This erasure wasn't accidental, but structural. Britain's standing alone mythology required forgetting imperial contributions. India and Pakistan's partition trauma and nationalist ambivalence about serving colonial powers made World War II uncomfortable to commemorate. Key revelations include the racist evacuation orders Captain Ashdown defied, revealing institutional hierarchies placed Indian lives below right British lives, even in extremis. The profound attachment between muleteers and animals, forcing men to abandon beloved mules that had survived the journey from Bombay. Not the criticism. The contradiction between wartime celebrity, 61 parades, royal meetings, official portraits, newsreels, and post-war amnesia. The double standard of colonial military service, fighting and dying for an empire while denied equal pay, recognition, or basic dignity. Yet also moments of transcendence. Major Akbar Khan's refusal to disarm and surrender despite orders, maintaining unit cohesion through leadership and faith. Jemadar Maula Dad Khan's magnificent courage, coolness and decision, saving his entire troop without losses under combined air and ground attack. The orderly column of 300 Indian soldiers marching through chaos on Dunkirk beaches, carrying their disabled imam and maintaining discipline when thousands panicked. The recovery of this history through recent scholarship represents more than historical correction. It's a political act of decolonization. Understanding who fought, who was forgotten, and why challenges national mythologies that continue to shape present attitudes about race, empire, and belonging. Force K6's forgotten warriors deserve recognition, not as footnotes, but as central actors in one of World War II's defining moments. Their story reveals uncomfortable truths about imperial military structures, exposes the political construction of memory, and reminds us that history's losers aren't military defeats, but those systematically excluded from the narratives nations tell themselves. The 35 graves scattered across Britain, the 5 names on the Dunkirk memorial with no known resting place, and the 2,238 documented names represent lives that mattered. Soldiers who maintained honor and professionalism in impossible circumstances. He was celebrated as heroes one moment and forgotten the next. He served an empire that never saw them as equals, yet still earned the highest decorations that empire could bestow. Their contribution wasn't minor or symbolic. It was essential logistics, enabling British Expeditionary Force operations, maintained under fire with exceptional discipline, executed by professional soldiers who chose cohesion over panic and duty over survival. They were the first Indian soldiers committed to the European theatre in World War II, representing the mobilization of 2.5 million volunteers that would provide Britain's strategic reserve throughout the war. Remembering Force K6 requires acknowledging the Empire's role in World War II, not to celebrate imperialism, but to recognize the 2.5 million Indians who volunteered, the 87,000 who died, and the profound injustice of their erasure. As one historian writes, "We must end the amnesia of the Empire and recognize that Britain never stood alone. It stood on the backs of millions of colonial subjects who fought, died, and were forgotten."